35 cents. That was what Dorothy Hale in Dayton, Ohio spent on dinner for a family of 5 in 1953. 1 skillet, 1 burner. Her husband worked second shift at the Delco plant and never once saw her cook. He just came home to a clean pan on the stove and a covered plate in the oven. That skillet fed them for 11 years. Number 14 on this list cost less than a dime per serving. Number 8 was the only recipe a generation of Southern grandmothers ever needed. Number 3 turned a can of soup into a dinner that felt like it came from a restaurant in Paris. These were not gourmet meals. These were dinners that asked almost nothing of you and gave back everything. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 25 lazy one-pan dinners from the 1950s that no one makes anymore. Number 25, Welsh rarebit. A melted cheese sauce poured over thick toast. That was the whole meal. In the 1890s, it was a fashionable dish served in silver chafing dishes at society parties. By the 1950s, it had moved from the parlor to the kitchen. Betty Crocker put it in her picture cookbook in 1950. The American version used Velveeta or processed cheddar, a can of Campbell's tomato soup, a splash of milk, and a pinch of dry mustard. You melted it all together in one saucepan over low heat. 15 minutes. The entire dish cost about 50 cents and fed 4 people. Your mother probably called it cheese toast. Your grandmother probably called it supper. It sat at a strange crossroads in the 1950s, a dish with a foreign name that any woman in America could make from 2 ingredients she already had in the cupboard. Number 24, Skillet Spanish rice. In 1949, General Foods launched Minute Rice on national television, and overnight rice became a weeknight staple. Before that, rice took 45 minutes on the stove. Minute Rice took 5. The man who invented it was an Afghan-American engineer named Ataullah Ozai Durrani, who sold the process to General Foods in 1941. The Army used it first, then the suburbs did. Skillet Spanish rice was 4 strips of bacon fried in a pan, the onion and green pepper cooked in the drippings, a can of diced tomatoes, a cup of minute rice, and a shake of chili powder. You covered it and waited 5 minutes. The whole thing cost under 60 cents. It was the first time most American housewives cooked rice on a regular weeknight without thinking twice about it. Before minute rice, rice was a Sunday ingredient. After minute rice, it was a Tuesday one. That shift changed the shape of the American dinner plate. Number 23, Franks and beans. In Rhode Island and Massachusetts, Saturday night meant one thing: hot dogs sliced into baked beans in a cast-iron skillet. The tradition went back generations in New England. By the 1950s, it was made with B&M canned beans at 20 cents and Oscar Mayer Franks at 35 cents a package. You added a tablespoon of brown sugar, a squeeze of mustard, and half an onion. 15 minutes on the stove. The whole meal cost about 65 cents for a family of 4. You served it with B&M brown bread from a can, which cost 15 cents. Nobody in New England questioned it. Nobody tried to improve it. It was the same every Saturday, the way church was the same every Sunday. Your grandfather ate it. His father ate it. That rhythm was not monotony. It was the architecture of a life that did not need variety to feel complete. Number 22, American chop suey. In Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, this was what your mother made when she had nothing planned: ground beef, elbow macaroni, and canned tomatoes in one skillet. It had no connection to actual Chinese chop suey. The name was borrowed to make plain meat and pasta sound like something. The real Chinese-American chop suey dated back to the 1890s in San Francisco. The New England version was a completely different dish that showed up in every school cafeteria and every community fundraiser cookbook from Boston to Hartford. 1 pound of ground beef at 45 cents, a box of elbows at 15 cents, 2 cans of tomatoes at 10 cents each. You browned the beef, added everything else, covered the skillet, and walked away for 15 minutes. Under 90 cents for the whole meal. Every family in New England had a version, and every family thought theirs was the original. It was the dish that proved you did not need a name for something for it to be the best meal of the week. Number 21, hash brown skillet with ground beef. This was the meal American men cooked when their wives were not home. It required no recipe and no finesse. Ground beef, diced potatoes, an onion, and whatever canned vegetable was in the pantry. You fried it all together in a cast-iron skillet until the potatoes were crispy. The whole thing cost about 80 cents. By 1955, Westerns dominated American television. Gunsmoke premiered that September. Wagon Train followed in 1957. Cowboy-themed recipes started appearing in women's magazines, and skillet hash got a new name: ranch skillet, cowboy supper, trail pan. The food was the same. The marketing was different. A man standing over a cast-iron skillet felt like something out of a frontier story, even if he was standing in a kitchen in Levittown. It was the only meal in the 1950s that men took credit for cooking. Everything else belonged to the women. This one, for some reason, belonged to the cowboys. Number 20. Creamed tuna on toast. Every Friday in Catholic America, millions of families needed a cheap dinner with no meat. The Catholic Church's Meatless Friday rule, which stayed in place until 1966, created guaranteed demand for this dish in cities like Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. You made a white sauce in one saucepan: butter, flour, milk. You folded in a can of tuna at 25 cents and a handful of frozen peas. You poured it over toast. The whole meal cost about 55 cents. It was the same dish as creamed chipped beef, only with fish instead of dried meat. Children who grew up in Catholic households in the 1950s remember it as the taste of Friday. Some remember it with nostalgia. Some remember it with dread. Most remember both at the same time. The Meatless Friday rule shaped an entire generation of home cooking. When the rule was relaxed in 1966, creamed tuna on toast disappeared from millions of kitchens almost overnight. The dish had no loyalty outside the obligation. Number 19. Liver and onions with gravy. Good Housekeeping ran it in January 1952 under the heading Thrifty Meals That Are Easy to Prepare. Beef liver cost 28 cents a pound in the mid-1950s, roughly half the price of ground beef. Pediatric nutrition literature of the era called it a superfood packed with iron and vitamin A. Mothers had scientific backing to serve it. You soaked the liver in buttermilk for 30 minutes, dredged it in flour, and fried it in a skillet with caramelized onions. A splash of beef broth in the pan made the gravy. The whole meal cost about 55 cents. It was mother's medicine disguised as dinner. By the 1960s, as families could afford better cuts, liver began a decline that has never reversed. The generation that grew up eating it swore they would never serve it to their own children. Most kept that promise. Number 18. Porcupine meatballs. This recipe survived the Depression and walked straight into the 1950s without changing a single ingredient. You mixed a pound of ground beef with a third of a cup of raw long-grain rice, an egg, salt, and Worcestershire sauce. You rolled them into balls. The rice was the trick. It cooked inside the meatball, poking out like quills, and it stretched a single pound of beef into twice as many servings. You browned the balls in a skillet, poured in a can of Campbell's tomato soup diluted with water, covered the pan, and simmered for 40 minutes. The whole meal cost about 70 cents. Betty Crocker put it in her picture cookbook in 1950. Better Homes and Gardens printed it through the entire decade. Church cookbooks in Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee carried it well into the 1960s. In rural Appalachia, a mother named Eileen Combs made porcupine meatballs every Monday for 8 years. She stretched 1 pound of ground beef across 7 plates. Her husband worked at the coal mine in Harlan County, Kentucky, and brought home $42 a week. She spent 9 of those dollars on groceries. The meatballs were the anchor of her weekly rotation. The dish embodied a contradiction that defined the era. The post-war prosperity was real. Families were buying houses, cars, television sets. But millions of households, particularly in the rural South and Midwest, were still feeding large families on Depression logic. Porcupine meatballs were a survival strategy dressed in Eisenhower-era clothing. You could serve them to company and nobody would know the recipe was born out of desperation. That was the point. The rice inside the meatball was not a garnish. It was a way to make less look like enough. And for a generation of mothers who remembered what real hunger felt like, making less look like enough was not laziness. It was a skill passed down by women who learned it from their own mothers during the worst years this country has known. Number 17, macaroni and cheese from scratch. Kraft had introduced its boxed version in 1937 during the Depression and sold 8 million boxes in the first year at 19 cents each. By the 1950s, both versions existed side by side in the same kitchens. The scratch version was the one you made for company. Elbow macaroni, a white sauce of butter, flour, and milk, and 2 cups of real cheddar or Velveeta, which melted smoothly and did not break. You cooked it all in one pot. The whole dish cost about 55 cents from scratch, compared to 19 cents for the box. That gap told you everything about the decade. The housewife who served scratch macaroni and cheese to guests and Kraft on Tuesdays was performing a quiet negotiation about what kind of cook she was and what kind of evening this was going to be. Number 16, corned beef hash skillet. Hormel introduced Mary Kitchen canned corned beef hash around 1950. It became the #1 selling hash in America and has held that position ever since. The skillet technique was simple. You pressed the hash flat in a cast iron pan, let it form a dark brown crust on the bottom, flipped it in sections, and cracked 2 eggs over the top. 15 minutes. Under 55 cents. Corned beef hash was what veterans made. It required nothing perishable. It tasted like the Army, like the Navy, like basic training. In the early 1950s, with 16 million World War II veterans still in their 20s and 30s, this dish carried an emotional weight that went beyond the ingredients. It appeared on diner menus from Maine to California as a blue plate special for under half a dollar. Number 15, chicken fricassee. The dish had been in American cookbooks since the 18th century. Mary Randolph published a version in The Virginia Housewife in 1824. By the 1950s, convenience food had changed it completely. Poppy Cannon's Can Opener Cookbook in 1953 reduced the recipe to a single instruction: open a can. The home version was not much harder. You browned chicken pieces in a Dutch oven, added a can of cream of chicken soup, sliced mushrooms, onion, celery, and a splash of white wine. You covered it and simmered for 45 minutes. The whole meal cost about $1.20. Chicken fricassee had a French name. In the 1950s, that alone elevated a Tuesday dinner into something that felt like you were trying. Most women in America were making it from a can of soup. Nobody talked about that part. The name did the work. It made a 10-cent can of soup taste like ambition. Number 14, Sloppy Joes. The origin story splits between 2 places: Sioux City, Iowa, 1926, where a cook named Joe at Floyd Angel's Cafe added tomato sauce to loose meat sandwiches, and Havana, Cuba, where a bar owner named Sloppy Joe Abial y Otero served ground beef sandwiches as early as 1917. By the 1950s, the name was everywhere, and the dish was in every school cafeteria in America. There was no manwich yet. That canned sauce did not arrive until 1969, made by Hunt's. In the 1950s, you made it from scratch. 1 pound of ground beef at 45 cents, an onion, ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, a tablespoon of brown sugar. You browned the meat, added the sauce, simmered it for 10 minutes, and spooned it onto hamburger buns that cost 20 cents a bag. The whole meal for a family of 4 cost under 90 cents. The beauty of a Sloppy Joe was that it solved the central problem of the 1950s kitchen. You had 1 pound of ground beef. You had 5 or 6 mouths to feed. You needed a way to make that single pound stretch across every plate and still feel like a real meal, not a compromise. The tomato sauce did the work. It turned a 1/4 pound of beef per person into a full sandwich that dripped down your wrists and stained your shirt and made children feel like they were eating something generous. In Topeka, Kansas, a school cafeteria cook named Betty Simmons served Sloppy Joes to 400 children every Wednesday for 12 years. She used 10 pounds of beef and 5 bottles of ketchup. The children lined up twice. She never ran out. That was the trick of the whole decade. Not the food itself, but the feeling it created. Abundance was a performance. and the best cooks in America knew exactly how to stage it from a 45-cent pound of ground beef and a squeeze of ketchup. Number 13. Salmon patties. In the southern states, canned salmon was one of the cheapest protein sources you could buy. Pink salmon cost about 28 cents a can. The Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina, identified salmon patties as a defining dish of the southern working-class table. You drained a can of salmon, mixed it with an egg and crushed saltine crackers, formed patties, and fried them in bacon grease in a cast-iron skillet. 4 minutes per side. The whole meal cost about 45 cents. In Catholic households across the North, salmon patties were Friday food, the same as creamed tuna. For first-generation Jewish families in northern cities, canned salmon was both economical and kosher. A single tin and a handful of crackers stretched into dinner for 6. Your grandmother fried them until the edges were dark and crisp. She served them with lemon wedges and white bread. That was the whole plate. Nobody called it gourmet. Nobody needed to. Number 12. Hoppin John. The oldest published recipe appeared in The Carolina Housewife by Sarah Rutledge in 1847. The dish originated with the Gullah people of the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, descended from enslaved West Africans who brought both the recipe and the black-eyed pea crop to the Americas. By the 1950s, it was a one-pot tradition across the entire South. Dried black-eyed peas at 10 cents, a smoked ham hock at 20 cents, onion, garlic, and long-grain rice. You simmered the peas with the ham hock until tender, added the rice, covered the pot, and waited. The whole meal for 6 people cost under 60 cents. The ham hock was the cheapest pork cut available, essentially a bone with collagen and scraps. The dish encoded in its ingredients the resourcefulness of generations of families who had built an entire cuisine from what others threw away. On New Year's Day, eating Hoppin John meant good luck. Collard greens meant money. Cornbread meant gold. The tradition was old enough that nobody remembered who started it. They just did it. Number 11. Skillet pork chops with cream of mushroom gravy. Pan-fried pork chops with pan gravy go back to the 19th century in American cooking. The 1950s version replaced the scratch gravy with a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. Good Housekeeping recommended pork chops in a Thrifty Meals column in January 1952. Bone-in chops cost about 45 cents a pound. You browned 4 chops in a hot skillet, added sliced onion and mushrooms, poured in 1 can of soup mixed with half a can of water, covered the pan, and simmered for 25 minutes. The whole meal cost about 80 cents. The soup made its own gravy. You served it over egg noodles or mashed potatoes. For the working mother of the 1950s, the condensed soup eliminated the step that separated a 30-minute dinner from a 60-minute one. That step was the roux, and the roux was what most women quietly dreaded making on a Tuesday night. Number 10. Chicken a la king. Chef George Greenwald created the original at the Brighton Beach Hotel in Brooklyn, New York, around 1898, for proprietor E. Clark King II. By the 1950s, the dish bore almost no resemblance to its hotel origins. The home version was leftover chicken, a can of cream of chicken soup, jarred pimentos, frozen peas, and sliced mushrooms, all heated together in one skillet. A splash of sherry if you had it. You served it over toast points or biscuits. Using leftover chicken, the meal cost under 50 cents. Food writer Evan Jones wrote that in the 1950s, the whole country seemed to be awash in chicken a la king. It was served at wedding receptions, church banquets, and on blue plate diner menus from coast to coast. The can opener version told the 1950s housewife she could produce a hotel dish in her own skillet on a Wednesday night. And she did. She served it on toast points with a sprig of parsley, and nobody at the table knew it had taken 12 minutes. That was the whole performance. Number 9. Green bean casserole. In 1955, a home economist named Dorcas Riley at Campbell's Test Kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, was told to create a recipe using 2 ingredients assumed to be in every American pantry: canned green beans and cream of mushroom soup. She added soy sauce, black pepper, milk, and French fried onions on top. 6 ingredients. 1 baking dish. 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The dish did not test well internally. Riley pushed it through anyway. In 2002, Campbell's and Riley donated the original recipe card to the National Inventors Hall of Fame. As of recent estimates, the dish is served at 20 million Thanksgiving tables every year. 40% of all cream of mushroom soup sold in America goes into this single recipe. A trained corporate home economist, not a home cook, created the most replicated recipe in the country. That was the 1950s. Number 8. Chicken and dumplings. The dish had roots in 19th century Appalachian and Low Country cooking. Lettuce Bryan published a version with sweat dumplings in the Kentucky Housewife in 1839. Marion Cabell Tyree included stewed chicken with biscuit dumplings in Housekeeping in Old Virginia in 1879. By the 1950s, it was the comfort meal of the entire South. You simmered a whole chicken in a pot with onion, celery, and carrot for 90 minutes until the meat fell off the bone. You pulled the chicken out, stripped the meat, and dropped spoonfuls of dough into the simmering broth. Flour, baking powder, salt, milk, and a tablespoon of shortening. You covered the pot and steamed the dumplings for 15 minutes. The whole meal for 6 people cost about $1.10. A single chicken at 29 cents a pound fed a family because the dumplings turned broth into a meal. That was the economics of it, but the cultural weight went deeper. In East Tennessee, a woman named Opal Sizemore made chicken and dumplings every Sunday from 1948 until 1973. She used a 3-pound hen, a cup of flour, and nothing else but salt. Her pot fed her husband, 4 children, and whoever showed up at the door. She never measured anything. She never wrote it down. When she died, her daughter tried to make it and could not get the dumplings right. This was the dish Southern grandmothers brought to doorsteps when someone was grieving. They carried it in covered pots across neighborhoods in Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas. The dumpling style, whether you rolled them flat and cut them into ribbons or dropped them by spoon into fluffy clouds, was a matter of fierce regional identity that families argued about like religion. And the argument was never really about technique. It was about whose grandmother was right, whose kitchen smelled better on a Sunday afternoon, whose memory of that particular pot, carried to a neighbor whose husband had just died, was the one that mattered most. The dumplings were flour and milk. The meaning was something else entirely. That meaning is what disappeared, not the recipe. The recipe is in every cookbook in the South. What disappeared was the woman who made it without looking at one. Number 7. Hamburger skillet. Some called it American goulash. Others called it skillet macaroni and beef. In the Midwest, it was just goulash. In the South, it was skillet supper. The recipe appeared on Hunt's tomato sauce can labels in the 1950s. Home cooks recalled learning it from matchbook cover recipes advertising Hunt's sauce. 1 pound of ground beef, an onion, a green pepper, 2 cans of tomatoes, elbow macaroni, garlic salt, and chili powder. You browned the beef, added the vegetables and uncooked pasta, poured in the tomatoes, covered the skillet, and simmered for 20 minutes. The whole meal cost under $1. 1 pound of ground beef at 45 cents fed 4 to 6 people when you stretched it with pasta and tomatoes. The dish crossed every regional and class boundary in the country. It did not matter if you lived in a farmhouse in Nebraska or an apartment in the Bronx. If you had a skillet and a pound of ground beef, you had dinner. That simplicity was the whole point. Number 6. Pork chops and rice casserole. This was a direct product of the canned soup era. You browned 4 bone-in pork chops, poured a cup of uncooked rice into a baking dish, mixed 1 can of French onion soup with 1 can of water over the rice, laid the chops on top, covered the dish with foil, and put it in the oven at 350 degrees for 1 hour. That was the entire recipe. The dish cost about 75 cents. Campbell's promoted one-dish meals aggressively in the early 1950s, and this was one of their best performers. The appeal was pure time. You assembled it in 5 minutes and walked away for an hour. For women who worked and also cooked, which was increasingly common by mid-decade, it was liberation in a baking dish. The steam from the soup cooked both the rice and the pork simultaneously. You opened the oven and dinner was done. Number 5. One-pan chicken and rice. Campbell's Test Kitchen created this recipe in the late 1940s. It was printed on soup can labels beginning in the early 1950s and became one of the most reproduced promotional recipes in American food history. 1 baking dish, chicken pieces laid over uncooked rice, 1 can of cream of chicken soup mixed with 1 can of water poured over everything, salt, pepper, paprika. Cover with foil. Bake at 350 degrees for an hour and 15 minutes. The whole meal cost about $1.15. The recipe required almost no cooking skill. You poured, you arranged, you covered, you waited. The soup did everything. It steamed the rice. It braised the chicken. It made its own sauce. For a country full of young mothers with 3 children and a television set competing for their attention, that was exactly the kind of meal that kept a household running. Number 4. Sunday pot roast. The braising technique came to New England through French immigrants and to the Midwest through German settlers. Food writer James Beard traced the Yankee pot roast directly to French cooking adapted to tougher American beef cuts. By the 1950s, the Sunday pot roast was a cultural ritual. The family went to church. The roast went into the Dutch oven. 3 to 4 pounds of chuck at 55 cents a pound. Carrots, potatoes, onions, celery, beef broth, salt, pepper, and thyme. You covered it tightly and braised it at 325 degrees for 3 to 4 hours. The full meal for 6 people cost about $2.25. It was the most expensive meal on this list. And it was the one every generation knows by smell. The aroma of chuck roast braising on a Sunday morning while the family was at church and then came home to find dinner waiting. That smell was the architecture of the American weekend. Number 3. Beef stroganoff. The original dish was Russian, named for the Stroganoff family, dating back to the 1800s. The American version arrived through European immigrants and post-war soldiers who had encountered it abroad. By the mid-1950s, the recipe had been completely transformed. Campbell's cream of mushroom soup replaced the sour cream sauce. Cheaper cuts of round steak replaced the tenderloin. Betty Crocker published a version using condensed soup in the early 1950s. You sliced the beef thin, browned it in a skillet with mushrooms and onion, stirred in the soup and a cup of sour cream, and served it over egg noodles. The whole meal cost about $1.30. Women's magazines like Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens ran it repeatedly. It felt European. It felt sophisticated. It was dinner party food that a woman in Indiana could make on a Tuesday with a can of soup. That was the trick. It did not matter where a recipe came from. It mattered that it made your table feel like somewhere else. Number 2. Tuna noodle casserole. The first printed recipe appeared in 1930 in Sunset magazine under the name Noodles and Tuna Fish and Casserole. It came from the Pacific Northwest. The explosion happened in 1952 when Campbell's published a recipe booklet featuring tuna casserole as a showcase for cream of mushroom soup, which had been on shelves since 1934. 1 baking dish, canned tuna at 25 cents, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup at 10 cents, egg noodles at 20 cents, frozen peas and crushed crackers on top. Mix everything together. 375 degrees for 25 minutes. The whole meal cost about 80 cents for a family of 4. Church potlucks in the 1950s always featured at least 3 versions. It was the dish that every woman in America knew how to make, and nobody was proud of making. The cream of mushroom soup replaced the need for a homemade bechamel entirely. And that single substitution, a 10-cent can where a 20-minute sauce used to be, defined what cooking became in the 1950s. Number 1. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The recipe first appeared in the 1910 Manual for Army Cooks, published by the United States Army. It was standardized again in Army publication T M10-412 in August 1944. Every American serviceman from the First World War through Vietnam encountered it. Most despised it. They called it SOS. After the Second World War, 16 million veterans brought the recipe home. 1 jar of Armour's dried chipped beef at 35 cents, butter, flour, milk. You made a roux, added the shredded beef, stirred in the milk until it thickened into a white gravy, and poured it over toast. The whole dish cost about 60 cents. By the mid-1950s, it was appearing in community cookbooks from Kansas to Connecticut under the polite name creamed dried beef. Veterans made it on Saturday mornings. Their wives learned to make it because their husbands asked for it. The dish was simultaneously the most hated and most requested meal in post-war America. It tasted like survival. It tasted like the barracks, like the mess hall, like the years you spent waiting to come home. And for the men who made it in their own kitchens, it was proof that they had. Pork and sauerkraut are things that come right out of German-American communities. Put this in a pot and leave it to cook, and let the fragrance carry you right to the streets of Munich and Prague, where New Year's celebrations meant that everyone had an incredible amount of pork and sauerkraut available all the time. It's definitely a historical middle-class dish associated with the late 1900s, and the slow cooking meant that even really tough cuts of pork could become tender, soft, melt-in-your-mouth slices of pork that got anyone's appetite going. When people were exploring foods from other countries, Pennsylvania in particular took a big interest in German food. Maybe because it had its fair share of German-American communities, or maybe because it was just that good. But either way, if you wanted to take an express tour into what German eating felt like, you would go on over to the Midwest or Pennsylvania to try this. Black cherry jello. Salad was one of those dishes that combined sweetness and tang in a way that made it a staple at family gatherings and church potlucks. It used dark cherry gelatin as its base, which gave the dish a deep color and bold flavor. Cooks would fold in canned fruit, often pineapple or cherries, and add a layer of sour cream or whipped topping to balance the sweetness. The contrast of creamy and fruity layers made each spoonful a different experience, with textures that ranged from smooth to juicy. It was easy to prepare, could be made ahead of time, and looked elegant when served in a glass dish or mold. For many families, this salad brought a festive touch to the table, especially at holidays, where it added color and flavor alongside more traditional fare. Though it has largely faded from today's recipe collections, it remains remembered for its vibrant appearance and unique flavor combination. Number 21. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The military gave it a name that cannot be printed here. Mothers kept it clean. Thin slices of dried beef, salt-cured and almost leathery, torn into strips and dropped into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, poured over thick slices of white toast. That was supper. In working-class neighborhoods across Ohio and Pennsylvania, and in mill towns from the Piedmont to the Monongahela Valley, this was a weeknight staple from the 1940s all the way through the 1960s. A jar of dried beef cost 35 cents in 1965. It fed 4 people over toast. The roux had to be stirred constantly or it scorched, which is why every woman who made it stood at the stove the whole time. There were no shortcuts. The white sauce either came together smooth or it didn't. Most mothers could tell by the smell when it was right. They didn't use a timer, they just knew. That is a kind of skill you can't buy. One-pan sausage pasta is a name you would never have heard just a few decades before. But now it brings together the best of Italian comfort cooking and American convenience culture to make one incredibly satisfying dish. We've all been there, right? Days where pasta could cure us, but the effort seems way too much for the amount of gas we have left in the tank? That's when recipes like these come in handy. All of the pasta and meat cook together, so the noodles don't ever feel disproportionately flavored. Every strand of noodle is infused with the taste of the sausage. The slow cooking really helps break down the fats, and what you get is something that tastes way more dense flavor-wise than anything else. Seafoam salad was a light and airy dish that brought together flavors and textures in a way that fascinated mid-century cooks. Using lime jello as a base, it combined cream cheese, whipped cream, and crushed pears into a frothy, fluffy creation that almost melted in the mouth. Its pale green color gave it an ethereal quality, leading to its whimsical name. This was the kind of recipe that felt special without being difficult. Perfect for bridge club luncheons, bridal showers, or summer gatherings. Its sweetness was balanced by the slight tang of the cream cheese, creating a dish that was more sophisticated than many other gelatin salads of the time. The combination of canned pears and packaged gelatin made it easy to assemble quickly, which was a major draw for busy homemakers. Though few people make seafoam salad today, it stands as an example of the playful experimentation that defined American cooking in the 1950s and 60s, when presentation and creativity mattered as much as practicality. Number 18. Potato and onion skillet hash. 4 potatoes, 1 onion, bacon grease in the bottom of a cast iron skillet. Your mother sliced the potatoes thin so they cooked fast, laid them flat in the hot grease and pressed them down with a spatula, then left them alone long enough to brown before she turned them. The onions went in halfway through, softening and turning sweet against the crust that had formed on the potatoes. Salt, pepper. That was all it needed. 1 pan, 1 flame. Under a dime. Under a dime. Nothing wasted. In rural communities across Tennessee and Kentucky, fried potatoes and onions was the supper that appeared when there was nothing in the house but the potato sack and the onion bin. A pound of potatoes cost about 5 cents in 1964. The skillet was ready in 20 minutes. Everyone ate until the pan was clean. No stove required beyond a flame and patience. No pots to wash but one. Dr. Pepper pulled work is something that comes right out of the aces of Southern barbecue traditions. You'll find vintage cookbooks calling for the use of a smoker, but the one-pot version makes it all way more convenient for you. All you need is a slow cooker, Dr. Pepper, and a great cut of pork you can trust with a blind eye, and then you're set. Usually people use Dutch ovens, but a lot of commercial slow cookers became very affordable and easily available. The best advantage of this way of cooking was that you could prepare a variety of other things like sides and desserts while this was cooked, as it didn't need any attention from you. The pork would caramelize without any worries, and the acidity from the soda would help make it an even more tender meal. Pink fluff salad was a pastel favorite that appeared on countless tables during the heyday of gelatin desserts and whipped topping concoctions. Typically made with strawberry jello, whipped topping, and cottage cheese, it created a light and creamy dish that blurred the line between side and dessert. Marshmallows or canned fruit were often folded in to give it extra sweetness and texture, making it appealing to both children and adults. It was a dish that felt celebratory, perfect for holidays, showers, or community dinners where colorful food was part of the fun. Homemakers liked pink fluff salad because it was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and guaranteed to look cheerful on the table. Its soft texture and bright color made it a favorite among children, while its creamy sweetness gave adults a dose of comfort. Though it has largely disappeared from modern recipe collections, pink fluff salad remains a nostalgic reminder of the playful, creative cooking style that defined mid-century potlucks and family gatherings. Number 17. Hoover stew. Named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who left office in 1933 with bread lines stretching around city blocks, Hoover stew lived on in American kitchens for 30 more years after the Depression officially ended. Macaroni noodles, sliced hot dogs, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a can of corn. All in one pot. Boil the macaroni, add the rest, let it simmer until the tomatoes had soaked into the pasta. In shantytown communities called Hoovervilles during the 1930s, this exact formula fed hundreds out of community pots. By the 1960s, it had moved, generation by generation, into the kitchens of working-class families in Cleveland and Detroit and Gary, Indiana, where it was just called mac and hot dogs. A package of macaroni was 19 cents in 1965. A can of tomatoes was 15 cents. 4 hot dogs stretched to feed 5 people. That was dinner for under 50 cents. The name Hoover had long since been forgotten. The meal hadn't. I'll forgive you for thinking this is another showcase of how we tried to copy other countries' culinary mojo, because Swiss steak does sound pretty well Swiss. What might raise your eyebrow is that this is actually a purely American dish. It involved braising, which is a kind of slow cooking that tenderizes any cut of meat to the maximum, and this one involved a round steak in a tomato-based sauce with bell peppers. It was a pretty big classic in the 30s and 40s. Whenever people could afford to get some cuts of meat, they were usually cheap, and as a result, they were more than likely to be tough ones. A dish like this that could take even rubber disguised as beef and turn it into a buttery, smooth steak was a godsend in those times. The fact that it didn't need a lot of work on the side to make it shine also meant that it was something the populace could really jibe with, and slow cooker meant that you could braise away without worry. It wasn't one of the most popular steaks ever, and of course, if you were working with recipes that were centered around making better cuts of meat shine, you'd probably get a more decent steak experience, but it was a homely meal to have after a tough shift or a day spent taking care of the kids. Can anyone ask for more relief? Especially when cooking, it became a non-issue later on. Pineapple Bavarian cream salad belonged to the family of molded desserts that were once considered the height of elegance in American dining. Housewives would prepare a gelatin base flavored with pineapple juice, fold in whipped cream, and let it set in decorative molds that made it look far fancier than the effort required. The result was a creamy, sweet dish that struck a perfect balance between richness and lightness, often served at luncheons or holiday dinners. Its exotic touch came from the pineapple, which in mid-century America still carried connotations of tropical luxury. Recipes often encouraged garnishing with extra fruit or whipped cream, making it as much a visual centerpiece as a dessert. Cookbooks from the 1950s and 60s frequently praised Bavarian creams for their versatility, and pineapple was a particularly popular version because it paired well with both sweet and savory menus. Today, the idea of molded cream salads feels dated, but in their time, they were treasured recipes that signaled hospitality, sophistication, and an eagerness to impress guests with something beautiful and sweet. Number 24. Cornmeal mush with milk. A pot of water, a cup of cornmeal, a pinch of salt. Stir it until it thickened. Pour it into a bowl with warm milk over the top and a thread of sorghum if you had it. That was supper. In farm communities across southern Indiana and the hill country of southern Ohio, cornmeal mush appeared on the table 3 or 4 nights a week in lean seasons. A pound of yellow cornmeal cost 8 cents in 1963. A family of 5 could eat for under a dime. What most people do not know is that leftover mush was sliced cold the next morning, fried crispy in the same skillet it was cooked in, and eaten with syrup for breakfast. Nothing was wasted. The pot was rinsed, not scrubbed. The cornmeal cooked right down to the bottom would flavor the next batch. That was the whole recipe, and it stretched across 2 meals. Navy bean soup, as the name implies, is one right out of the cookbooks of the military. See, all those soldiers get so awfully tired from traveling to other countries all of the time, they end up needing soups filled with ham and cured pork to put some pep in their step. Navy bean soup was particularly nice for 2 reasons. It was already cheap, which was kind of the theme of the time with the World Wars. But even after that, the habit of rationing and using cheap ingredients for military ventures didn't really go away. Anything that cuts costs, right? Navy bean soup definitely knew how to save money. And once slow cookers became a thing, it was saving time too. The second reason is that it was pretty easy to make wherever you were, and it was easy to carry around too, in pots or a thermos. This meant that it was the perfect military food. Healthy, easy to make in bulk, and easy to carry around. Don't think it takes a genius to figure out why they abused this recipe to the moon and back. Sunshine salad was the kind of dish that lived up to its name, bright, cheerful, and guaranteed to stand out on any buffet table. Made with orange jello, shredded carrots, and pineapple, it was a combination that balanced sweetness with a slight crunch. At church socials and community potlucks, this salad often carried a sense of cheer, its glowing orange hue making it instantly recognizable. For many families, it was a holiday tradition as well, showing up at Easter or Christmas dinners alongside more savory dishes. The sweetness of the pineapple helped mask the earthiness of the carrots, making it appealing to children and adults alike. Recipes often called for topping it with whipped cream or a light mayonnaise dressing, depending on whether the cook leaned sweet or savory. Though it might seem unusual today to mix carrots into gelatin, Sunshine salad reflects the creativity and practicality of mid-century homemakers who were eager to stretch ingredients and create something that was both inexpensive and memorable. Number 22. Tomato gravy on biscuits. When the garden exploded with tomatoes in August and there was nothing else ready to pick, A woman in rural Tennessee or the upland counties of Georgia made tomato gravy. She melted bacon grease in a skillet, added a spoonful of flour and let it brown, then poured in garden tomatoes she had crushed by hand, salt, a pinch of sugar, black pepper. She stirred it until the flour and tomatoes became something thicker, tangier, and more satisfying than either one alone. Poured over split biscuits, it was a full meal. By mid-September, when the tomatoes were coming in faster than they could be canned, families ate this 4 or 5 nights running. It did not feel like poverty food when the tomatoes were that ripe. It felt like the best time of the year. Healthy, filling, free from the garden. Appalachian communities still make tomato gravy today. They don't call it poverty food. They call it summer. Apricot chicken probably came from the Middle East, and to be honest, you'll see a lot of dishes that are going to be from other cuisines and cultures. It's because around the same time the slow cooker was born, there was this desire that enveloped the masses, which steered them away from the sausages, bacon breakfasts, and hash browns that America already offered. They wanted to see what was there in other countries, what their streets smelled like, and what kind of food you could find there. Apricot chicken stew is a good example of the kind of flavors you can expect out of a Middle Eastern joint, with tangy and savory focuses being the star of the show. The one-pot method really helps break down the apricot and provide that tanginess, along with a rich sweetness that brings all of it together. It's an incredible way to have your chicken, and if you're on a bulk diet, this is way tastier than grilled fillets over rice. Frozen fruit salad was a refreshing dish that perfectly suited hot summer days, requiring little more than a freezer and a few canned goods. Made by folding whipped cream or mayonnaise into a mixture of canned fruit, marshmallows, and sometimes nuts, it was spooned into molds or loaf pans before being frozen. Once sliced, it revealed colorful pieces of fruit suspended in a creamy base, making it both pretty and satisfying. Families loved it because it could be made ahead of time and served straight from the freezer, saving stress during big gatherings. In community cookbooks, frozen fruit salad was often promoted as a light dessert or a fancy salad to accompany savory meals at potlucks. Children enjoyed the sweet flavors, while adults appreciated its coolness and novelty. Its versatility allowed cooks to adjust the ingredients depending on what was on hand, whether it was cherries, peaches, or pineapple. Today, it may seem unusual to freeze something called a salad, but in its time, it was a clever, thrifty way to stretch ingredients and create a dish that delighted guests. Number 19. Cabbage and salt pork. A head of cabbage cost 9 cents in 1963. A quarter pound of salt pork cost about 12 cents. Together in a single pot, covered with water and simmered for an hour, they became something that fed a table of 6 for under 25 cents total. In the German farming communities of central Missouri and the Czech settlements of South Texas, the pot liquor from the cabbage was considered as valuable as the cabbage itself. Children were given the broth in a cup like a drink. Nothing was left in the pot. That's how cheap and effective this meal was. The salt pork flavored everything it touched, and when you pulled it out after cooking, whatever meat clung to the bone was divided between the smallest children first. The woman at the pot didn't have to be told that. It wasn't discussed. It was understood. You fed the young ones from what was closest to the bone. Back in those days, that was just how it worked. As a country, we can thank Texas for a lot of things. Tex-Mex cuisine, an infinite supply of memes thanks to country music, rodeos, some of the nicest BBQ sauces you'll ever have, and a guaranteed chuckle every time you have to speak to a redneck Republican. If you want to keep adding to the list, a good chili con carne is something that'll make you even more thankful the state exists and has developed into the savory jackpot it is. The dish pretty much means chili with meat, and it's a wonderful blend of beef, chilies, and spices with roots in the Mexican borderlands. It's somewhat become a symbol of Texas cooking too, which is known for not being easy on your stomach at all. This dish is no different because it takes cubed beef, chili peppers, and beans, plus some canned tomatoes, and puts them in a slow cooker. The one-pot way of cooking it was kind of considered a massive game changer because, while yes, you could just leave it to cook now, it meant that you didn't have to stir the chili constantly. The thing with chili con carne is that unless you did that stirring, you really wouldn't get the same bang for your buck. Inexpensive, popular in chili parlors, and very good with a cold beer, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out how this dish has all the elements it needs to succeed in middle-class Texas. Copper Penny's salad was a colorful, tangy dish made from sliced carrots that resembled shiny coins, giving it its distinctive name. The carrots were boiled briefly until tender, then marinated in a dressing of tomato soup, vinegar, sugar, and onions. Served chilled, the salad had a sweet and sour flavor that paired well with grilled meats and was a popular make-ahead dish for picnics or potlucks. Its bright orange color made it a cheerful addition to buffet tables, while its zesty flavor kept it from being overly sweet like many other mid-century salads. Homemakers appreciated its convenience because it could be made in large batches and stored for days, often tasting better after the flavors had time to meld. In many households, Copper Penny's salad became a staple recipe clipped from church cookbooks or passed among neighbors. Though it has faded from modern kitchens, it represents a time when resourcefulness and creativity turned simple vegetables into crowd-pleasing dishes that carried both flavor and fun. Number 25. Water gravy on toast. When there was not any milk, butter, or meat left in the house, there was still flour, water, and the drippings stuck to the bottom of a skillet. Your mother scraped those drippings loose, added a spoonful of flour, stirred until it browned, then poured in enough water to pull it all into a thin, dark gravy. She poured it over toast and set it on the table. In the hollows of West Virginia and the mill towns along the Catawba River in North Carolina, water gravy was the meal that appeared when nothing else was left. It didn't have a name in most households. Back then, families called it gravy and bread because naming it would have made it real. Would have meant saying out loud that the week had run dry. A little bacon drippings made it taste richer than it had any right to. One skillet, 5 minutes. No pots to wash. That was enough to put something warm in your stomach before bed. Simple food works that way. One of the oldest one-pot meals you can find in this entire national culinary transition is Boston baked beans. They're known for being from there because Boston was a major player in the rum trade. And that comes into play because it meant that Boston had an ample supply of molasses all the time. This is what was used in the baked beans instead of the colonial-era recipe, which involved maple syrup. Some local takes on the dish even had people mixing it in with different sauces like Worcestershire and barbecue sauce, but that's not where all the magic is. I'm telling you, slow cooking in one pot is a whole other ball game. It's because it really lets the beans soak up every single ingredient, every note, aftertaste, hints of flavor profiles. All of that goes firmly into the beans, and you end up with one really rich pot of food. Not a bad deal, right? Plus, with these, you don't even have to waste time watching them simmer. 7-layer salad was as much about presentation as it was about flavor, a dish designed to show off the abundance of the American kitchen. Layered in a clear glass bowl, it became a visual feast with bright greens, peas, cheddar cheese, bacon, chopped eggs, and more stacked neatly on top of one another. The crowning glory was always a thick layer of mayonnaise or creamy dressing spread across the top, sealing the salad and keeping it fresh until served. It was a dish that encouraged gathering around the table because diners would scoop down through the layers, mixing textures and flavors with each serving. This salad often appeared at church picnics, barbecues, and holiday spreads, where it symbolized both generosity and creativity. It was hearty enough to serve as a main dish, especially in summers when people avoided heating the oven, yet simple enough to prepare with pantry staples. While modern diets might shy away from such heavy use of mayonnaise, 7-layer salad remains a nostalgic reminder of a time when presentation mattered and sharing colorful food was a form of pride. Number 16. Hamburger gravy over rice. A 1/4 pound of ground beef, browned in the skillet with a diced onion until it broke into crumbles. A spoonful of flour stirred in to make a roux with the drippings. Beef broth or water added slowly, stirred until a thin brown gravy formed around the meat. Poured over white rice that had been cooked while the gravy came together. In the farming communities of the Mississippi Delta and the rural counties of Arkansas, This was called Hamburger gravy, and it was understood that 1/4 pound of meat could feed a family of 5 over rice without anyone walking away hungry. Ground beef cost 49 cents a pound in 1965. A cup of dry rice cost less than a dime. 4 people full for under 30 cents a serving. There is no restaurant in America that has figured out how to charge for that ratio. There never will be. The math doesn't work in their favor. Mulligan stew is a dish that's often associated with lower-class cooking, and it was even something that homeless people relied on to get by the week. It can be best described as a makeshift meal, though if I were being fully real with you, it was just the best you could make out of whatever scraps you had. What I couldn't tell you is how nice this actually ended up being, and the invention of the slow cooker meant that it took a lot less time to make. You could make it with potatoes, vegetables, or even dumplings, and it has evolved from a meal that you'd usually associate with horrible times and poverty to a staple of home-cooked one-pot meals. Working and middle-class families often resort to this when they want to take care of everyone's appetite in one go, and man, it really works. Congealed cranberry salad was a holiday classic that graced many Thanksgiving and Christmas tables during the mid-20th century. It combined canned cranberry sauce with gelatin, pecans, and sometimes pineapple or celery for added texture. Once set in a decorative mold, the salad held its shape and became both centerpiece and side dish. It was often served alongside turkey and stuffing, giving a sweet and tangy contrast to the savory meal. Families appreciated it not only for its taste, but also because it could be prepared in advance and stored until the big dinner. The bright red color and festive appearance made it a tradition for generations, and it was often featured in community cookbooks of the era. Today, it might seem unusual to modern palates, but in its time, it was a dish that represented creativity, efficiency, and a sense of occasion. For many, it was inseparable from the memory of holiday gatherings. Number 20. Egg drop soup, Depression style. Not the Chinese restaurant version with cornstarch and sesame oil. This was something different entirely. A woman in rural Alabama or the Ozark communities of Missouri browned sliced potatoes and onions in a little lard, added water to fill the pot, seasoned with salt and a bay leaf, and when the broth was rolling, she cracked 2 eggs directly into the pot and stirred fast. The eggs broke into long golden ribbons through the hot broth. It was protein without the cost of meat. Eggs averaged 53 cents a dozen in 1965. For a family of 4, 2 eggs in a pot of broth and potatoes was a full supper for under 20 cents. Nobody called it egg drop soup. It's a simple and beautiful piece of ingenuity. They called it potato broth, or just the egg soup. The name was not important. Getting everyone fed before dark was. Snickers salad was one of the more playful and quirky dishes to appear at Midwestern potlucks, reflecting the region's love of turning candy into something that could be called a salad. This sweet creation combined chopped candy bars with apples, whipped topping, and sometimes pudding mix, creating a dessert that was rich, creamy, and slightly crunchy. Despite its unusual name, it became a beloved treat at church basements and school functions where children eagerly piled it onto their plates. For adults, it was both a nostalgic indulgence and a conversation piece, blurring the line between dessert and side dish. The contrast between tart apples and sweet chocolate made it more balanced than it sounds, and its simplicity made it quick to prepare in just minutes. Cookbooks and community recipe cards from the late 20th century often featured it as a way to dress up ordinary fruit. While modern tastes might scoff at calling candy-laden dishes salads, Snickers salad captures the inventive and humorous spirit of American potluck culture. Number 23. Dried corn soup. After the last ears of summer corn came off the stalks, women across the hill country of Pennsylvania and West Virginia cut the kernels thin and laid them out to dry on old window screens set in the sun. By October, the kernels had shriveled to hard, pale chips with a concentrated sweetness that fresh corn never had. Come November, a handful went into a pot of water with a piece of side meat, an onion, and nothing else. The pot simmered all afternoon while your grandmother worked at something else. By supper, the dried kernels had swollen back up and turned the broth milky and thick. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, among Mennonite and Pennsylvania Dutch families, this was called dried corn soup, and it appeared every winter without fail. The flavor was not like canned corn. It was deeper, almost nutty, the way something tastes when summer has been cooked down to its most honest form. One pot. No stove skill required beyond patience. The women who made it were alive to the fact that summer did not last. They made it last anyway. Make one of these this week. Pick the simplest one. The sloppy joes, the franks and beans, the skillet Spanish rice. Do not look up a better version online. Make it the way your grandmother would have. One pan, no fuss. Sit at the table when you eat it, not the couch. Because these meals were never about being lazy. They were about being smart with what you had. A 35-cent dinner that fed 5 people was not a failure of ambition. It was a kind of genius that nobody wrote down in cookbooks because it did not need a recipe. It needed a skillet and a mother who understood that feeding a family was not about the food on the plate. It was about the fact that there was a plate at all. Share which one you are going to make in the comments. Tell us if the porcupine meatballs get more love than the corned beef hash. Tell us if your mother made the tuna casserole or the chicken fricassee. Because these are not just forgotten dinners. They are proof that the simplest meal, made in one pan, served on one plate, eaten at one table, can still be an act of love.